Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This one, this one is going to stay with you. The rain in Portland in December is not the rain of other cities. It does not arrive with any drama. It does not announce itself with thunder or the theatrical darkening of skies. It simply appears a fine, relentless presence, as though the clouds have always been there and simply decided at some point in early November that they would stay. By December, the residents stop checking their phones for weather updates. They carry umbrellas the way other people carry keys. They learn not to expect the sun, and in doing so, stop missing it. Nora had been living in Portland for 7 months. She had not stopped missing the sun. She had not stopped missing a lot of things. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag against her shoulder and pushed through the glass door of heliotrope books, stepping from the warm amber glow of the shop into the cold, wet evening. The bell above the door chimed once. Behind her, she could hear Paul, the owner, calling out his standard closing time farewell. "See you Thursday, Elena," and she raised a hand in response without turning back. Elena Park, that was who she was here, had been for 7 months and 4 days. The name had belonged to a college roommate, a woman Nora had not spoken to in 6 years, who was currently living in Brisbane, Australia with a graphic design business and 2 rescue dogs. Nora had chosen it the way people choose emergency exits in unfamiliar buildings quickly, without much thought, guided mostly by instinct, and the simple logic that it was the first name she could remember that wasn't her own. She paused on the sidewalk and pulled her coat closed. The wool was thick, and the buttons had been left undone since October, when she could no longer fasten them across her stomach without straining the fabric. She had bought the coat secondhand at a thrift store on Burnside for $14. It was olive green and slightly too long in the sleeves, and she had never loved a piece of clothing more in her life. 7 months. 29 weeks to be precise. She had been counting in weeks for so long that months had started to feel like approximations. The streetlights were on pooling orange reflections on the wet asphalt. A few other pedestrians moved past her heads, down collars, up the collective choreography of a city that had made its peace with perpetual gray. Nora stood still for a moment and watched her breath mist in front of her face and let herself do the things she had gotten very good at not doing during business hours. She thought about Julian, not the argument, not the night she had sat in their kitchen at 11 o'clock with her phone in both hands and listened to a voice she did not recognize tell her in precise and unhurried language exactly what would happen to the child she was carrying if she remained in Seattle. Not the hotel room afterward where she had booked a single night under a false name and sat on the edge of the bathtub and made herself be very calm and very methodical about what came next. She thought about the earlier version of him. The version from before the expansion into the East Coast markets turned him into someone who answered emails at 2 in the morning. The Julian who had stood in the kitchen of their first apartment in Queen Anne and burned scrambled eggs with complete confidence, insisting he had the technique right, that it was the pan that was wrong. The Julian who had a habit of reaching for her hand in the middle of conversations about completely unrelated things in the car at dinner tables, while she was trying to read as though he needed to periodically confirm she was still there. She had loved his hands. She pressed one palm flat against the underside of her belly, a gesture she had developed sometime around week 22, and now performed without thinking, a steadying touch partly for the baby and partly for herself. The baby moved in response, a slow rolling shift that she had learned to interpret as acknowledgement rather than protest. They had developed their own language over these months, the two of them. A private vocabulary of kicks and turns and middle-of-the-night restlessness. She started walking. She had 8 blocks to cover and the rain was picking up. She was at the 3rd block when she saw it. A black SUV parked at the curb in front of the corner cafe. Not unusual, there were dozens of black SUVs in Portland on any given evening. Except that this one had a license plate she didn't recognize from the neighborhood, and it was idling. And the model was a Cadillac Escalade, the kind that corporate security teams drove, not the kind that belonged to private citizens who lived near independent bookshops. She stopped walking. The driver's door opened. Thomas Reed stepped out first. Nora's stomach dropped. Thomas was Julian's head of security, had been for 8 years. Had known Nora for 3 of those years, had attended their wedding in the 2nd row on the groom's side. He was a large man who moved quietly, the way large men sometimes do when they've spent years making themselves inconspicuous. He did not look at Nora. He stood beside the car and looked at the street ahead, which was the posture of someone who was waiting. The rear door opened. Julian Ashworth stepped onto the sidewalk. He was wearing a dark coat, charcoal wool, the one he'd had since before they met, and he was thinner than she remembered, and his hair was slightly longer, and none of that was what she noticed first. What she noticed first was that he looked up immediately directly at her, as though he had known exactly which direction to look, as though the distance between them was a line he had already measured. The rain fell between them. Neither of them moved. She was aware of her coat undone. She was aware of her stomach unmistakable. She was aware that 7 months of careful, painstaking construction. The new name, the secondhand furniture, the part-time job, the practiced answers to questions about her past had just collapsed in the space of a single glance. His face did not change expression. That was the thing about Julian that had always undone her. His face was not a mirror of his interior. It never had been. You had to learn to read him in smaller ways, in the set of his shoulders, in the specific quality of his silences and what his hands were doing when the rest of him was perfectly still. His hands, she could see from here, were at his sides. His left hand was a fist. She pressed her palm harder against her stomach and felt the baby shift again, that slow rolling acknowledgement, and she thought 7 months. 7 months and 4 days. She had been so careful, she had been so sure. His voice, when it came, crossed the distance between them, with no effort at all, the way it always had, quiet and certain and inevitable. "Get in the car, Nora." Not an order. Not quite. It was the voice of a man who had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this moment and had at the last second discarded all of them. She stood in the Portland rain, 29 weeks pregnant, in a second-hand olive green coat, and she thought I knew it would be him. She just hadn't known it would be tonight. She did not get in the car immediately. She stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 seconds. She counted them, and she looked at Julian Ashworth across 40 feet of wet Portland street, and she did the rapid involuntary arithmetic of someone who had spent 7 months preparing for a scenario she had also spent 7 months hoping would never arrive. He did not move toward her. He did not repeat himself. He stood beside the car with his hands at his sides, and he waited, and that more than anything was what finally moved her feet. Julian's patience had always been the most dangerous thing about him. Other men pursued with noise and urgency, filling silences with argument, with pressure, with the relentless forward motion of people who were afraid that if they stopped moving, they would lose. Julian had always understood something that most people didn't, that waiting was itself a form of pressure. That stillness in the right hands could be more compelling than any pursuit. She walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away. He looked at her face first, not her stomach, her face, and she saw something move through his eyes that she did not have a word for. It was not anger. She had prepared for anger. She had been carrying the weight of anticipated anger for 7 months, rehearsing her responses to it, steeling herself against it. What she saw instead was something quieter, and in its way worse. He looked like a man who had been waiting for confirmation of something he had already known. "Julian, not here." His voice was the same. That was one of the things she hadn't been able to remember correctly, no matter how many times she'd tried the exact timbre of it. That particular quality of complete assurance, as though the words he said were simply a spoken version of a reality he'd already decided on. "Get in the car." She got in the car. Thomas closed the door behind her. She slid to the far side of the seat. Julian got in from the other side, and Thomas returned to the driver's seat and pulled the Escalade away from the curb with the unhurried competence of someone who had spent years removing difficult people from difficult situations. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The city moved past the windows, the lit storefronts, and the rain-glossed intersections, and the pedestrians with their umbrellas and their particular Pacific Northwest certainty of their own ability to endure. Nora looked at her hands in her lap. Her left hand was still pressed against the curve of her stomach. "How far along?" Julian did not phrase it as a question. 29 weeks, she paused. 3 weeks, give or take, from when I left." He was silent for 3 seconds. "You knew when you left." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. "You told me there was no pregnancy." "I told you the pregnancy wasn't viable." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this too, though she was aware now in the actual present tense of the conversation that rehearsal and performance were not the same thing. It was the closest I could get to the truth without telling you something that would have put the baby in danger. "What does that mean?" "It means I lied to protect her." She felt the baby move again, another slow shift lower this time, and she pressed her hand flatter. "There was a phone call, Julian, 2 days before I left. I was in the office. It was a number I didn't recognize, and the voice, it was a man, I think, or someone trying to sound like a man, told me that there were people who would be very unhappy if you had an heir. that they had resources and patience, and that if I cared about the pregnancy, I would think very carefully about whether I wanted to remain visible. Julian's head turned toward her for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. Those were the exact words, she said. I wrote them down afterward, in the hotel room. I still have the paper. Why didn't you come to me? Because I didn't know who I could trust. She met his eyes. She had been afraid of this moment, of the looking directly at each other-ness of it. But now that it was here, she found it was easier than she'd expected. Fear, it turned out, was heavier in anticipation. Because whoever made that call knew things they shouldn't have known, that I was pregnant. How far along what my schedule was that week. That meant it was someone with access to information that only a small number of people had. And you were in a meeting the whole day. 3 consecutive meetings. With your board, with the East Coast acquisition team, and with Diane. The name dropped into the car like a stone into water. Thomas's shoulders, barely perceptible, shifted. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You thought it was someone on my team. I thought it could be anyone. I didn't have enough information to rule anyone out, and I didn't have enough time to investigate. She turned to look out the window. I made the best decision I could with what I had. I'm not saying it was the right decision. I'm saying it was the only one I could live with. You made the decision to disappear, to let me believe our child was... He stopped. She turned back to him. His jaw was tight. His left hand resting on his knee had curled closed again, that same involuntary fist she'd noticed from across the street. Julian was not a man who showed distress easily. She had spent 3 years learning to recognize it in these small physical signatures, the closed fist, the slight flattening of his mouth, the quality of the silence that preceded certain sentences. Do you know, he said, what I told myself for the first month after you left? What I told myself every day to keep operating the way I was supposed to operate. Julian, I told myself that grief had a structure, that it was not unlike a corporate crisis, identifiable stages, a beginning and a middle and an end, actions to take at each phase. I told myself I could manage it the way I managed everything else with sufficient focus and forward motion. He paused. I was wrong. I was completely and entirely wrong, and I knew it by the end of the first week, but I kept doing it anyway because I did not have an alternative framework. I did not know how to grieve something that was not... He stopped again. She waited. I didn't know how to grieve the possibility of a person, he finished, something that had not yet been fully real to anyone but you. The car moved through an intersection. The rain intensified briefly, a sudden dense curtain that Thomas's wipers handled with calm efficiency. Nora thought about the hotel room she'd sat in 7 months ago. She thought about sitting on the edge of the bathtub for 45 minutes before she stopped shaking enough to make her first call. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's... Don't tell me it's inadequate. I know it's inadequate. I'm not asking for adequacy. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had shifted. I want to understand, that's all. I want to understand what happened. I know. So tell me the rest. She told him. She told him about the hotel room on night 1, the cash she'd pulled from the joint account, before switching to a personal account she'd opened 6 months earlier during a professional development trip to San Francisco. She told him about the bus south to Eugene, then the overnight bus north to Portland, the specific logic of doubling back being that it made tracking more difficult. She told him about the room she'd rented above a Vietnamese restaurant in the Alberta Arts District for the first 3 months, paying cash, giving the landlord the name Elena Park, which the landlord had accepted without interest, because the landlord had 11 other tenants and was primarily concerned with whether the rent arrived on time. She told him about the prenatal appointments, a clinic in Northeast Portland, a midwife named Dr. Pham who specialized in low-intervention births and asked very few questions about patients' personal histories. She told him about the first ultrasound at 12 weeks in a room that smelled of antiseptic and soft instrumental music lying on a paper-covered table while Dr. Pham moved the wand across her stomach and the sound of a heartbeat filled the small room. I cried, she said, in the car after. Not because I was sad, just because she was real and she was okay and I was alone and I didn't have anyone to call. She paused. I thought about calling you about 100 times. At the 12-week appointment and again at 20 weeks when they told me she was a girl and again when she started kicking, which was around week 23 and felt like... She stopped, tried to find the right word, like being tapped from the inside, like someone saying, I'm here. Don't forget I'm here. Julian had not moved. I got the part-time job at the bookshop in September, she continued. The owner, Paul, needed someone for the afternoon shifts, and I needed something that would get me out of the apartment and into human conversation before I forgot how to do it. He's a good man. He thinks my husband died in a car accident 18 months ago and that I moved to Portland to start over. She heard something in her own voice, a flatness she recognized from the early months when she'd been telling the cover story so often it had started to feel structural load-bearing. I didn't enjoy lying to him. I don't enjoy lying to anyone, except to me. She looked at him. I told you what I told you because I was trying to protect something you didn't know existed yet. That's different from lying for personal advantage, and I think you know that. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Yes, he said quietly. I know that. Outside, Portland moved past. They had been driving in a loose circuit. She realized Thomas was not taking them anywhere specific, just keeping them in motion the way you do when a conversation needs time and not destination. Julian? She took a breath. You said in the car you said there was someone on your team you didn't trust. From the second month. His jaw tightened again. Tell me. A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not. Then, after you left, I had Thomas do a full internal audit. Communication logs, financial records, calendar access. Someone had pulled your prenatal appointment, the one in October, the week before you disappeared. It was accessed on a tablet registered to the executive suite. The access came from outside business hours. Who has executive suite credentials? Myself. Thomas, my CFO, my general counsel. He paused. And Diane. There it was. The same name she'd been turning over for 7 months like a stone she was afraid to look under. Checking both sides and putting it back down and checking again. You suspected her. I had a correlation, not a proof. She knew the schedule, she had the access, she had... He stopped. Something moved across his face that she had almost never seen there before, frustration at his own limits. Julian was a man who operated in certainties. Uncertainty did not sit on him naturally. She had a reason. I understood the reason structurally even before I could confirm it. My father's will stipulates that if I produce a legitimate heir before the age of 40, the controlling stake in Ashworth Group reverts from Diane's trust to a direct line. She's held that control for 6 years. And you turn 40 in March. 14 weeks away. That's why now, Nora said half to herself. That's why the phone call when I was at 10 weeks. She needed me gone before you found out. Before there was a legal record, before there was a birth certificate, Julian said. Yes. The car moved through another intersection. The rain had lightened back to its usual steady, impassive presence. Nora sat with the information she'd just been handed and let it rearrange itself into a shape she could hold. Diane Ashworth. She had sat across from that woman at dinner 7 times. She had laughed at her jokes. She had asked her advice once about navigating Julian's particular brand of emotional unavailability, and Diane had said, he needs to trust you completely before he lets you in. Be patient. He's worth it. She had genuinely believed that. Do you have proof now? She asked. Thomas does. He looked forward toward the rain-spattered windshield toward Portland, rearranging itself in the headlights. I got the call from him 2 hours before I found you tonight. A private investigator in Seattle hired through a shell account paid in installments the last payment issued 3 weeks ago, filed a location report, your address in Portland, your work schedule, your legal alias. His voice was careful and precise and entirely flat. She knew where you were, Nora. She has known, I believe, for most of the past 7 months. The bottom of something dropped out. She didn't... Nora stopped. Started again. She never... No, she didn't act on it, which is the only reason I'm telling you in a car in Portland instead of at a police station. He turned to look at her. I don't know why she didn't act on it. I don't know what she was waiting for, or whether she had decided that your disappearance was sufficient, or whether she simply wanted to know where you were as a contingency. I don't know. What I know is that Thomas has the financial records and the PI's file, and that tomorrow morning I'm going to look my cousin in the face and ask her directly. Cousin, Nora said. You always call her your cousin. She is my cousin. She's the person who threatened our daughter. The car stopped. Not at a traffic light, they had arrived somewhere. Nora looked out the window and saw a building she didn't recognize, a modern mid-rise, the kind of property that existed in the gap between hotel and apartment service suites for people in town for more than a week. I keep a unit here, Julian said, when I'm in Portland for the regional operations reviews. He got out, came around, opened her door himself before Thomas could. She took the hand he offered without thinking, just the automatic reach of someone navigating a wet curb at 7 months pregnant, and felt his fingers close around hers. He helped her out. He did not let go immediately. "Are you in pain?" he asked. It was a practical question, asked practically, and she understood that it was the closest he was going to get right now to asking the dozen other questions that were underneath it. "I'm fine, she's fine, She stopped. The word we felt strange in her mouth. Large. "We're okay." He looked at her for one unguarded moment. Really looked in a way he had not permitted himself on the sidewalk or in the car, and she saw all of it move through his eyes in the space of a few seconds. The 7 months, and the grief he'd called structural, and the correlation not proof of Diane, and the ultrasound she'd been to alone, and the heartbeat he'd never heard. Then he let go of her hand and held the building door open. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make tea." Tab. The suite was what she would have predicted if she'd known to predict it, spare, functional, oriented toward work. A kitchen that suggested the possibility of cooking without encouraging it. A desk by the window with a neat arrangement of folders and a laptop closed. The view was of the city at night, the wet streets below, the reflected light of street lamps smearing orange across the wet pavement. She sat at the kitchen table in her coat because she wasn't quite ready to remove it. Julian moved through the kitchen with the particular competence of someone who could not cook but could follow the logic of where things were stored. He found tea in the third cabinet he tried. She watched him fill the electric kettle. He had a way of occupying space, had always had it, that made rooms feel differently sized. Not smaller exactly, just more specific, more present. It was something she had noticed on their second meeting, had attributed at the time to his professional reputation, and had later come to understand was simply a property of who he was. Julian Ashworth believed in some fundamental and non-arrogant way that the things he chose to pay attention to were worth paying attention to. That quality made him formidable in boardrooms and occasionally exhausting in kitchens. She had always privately found it beautiful. "You should take off your coat," he said without turning around. "I'm fine." "You're wet. Take it off." She took it off. The baby was immediately undeniably visible, that specific late pregnancy fullness that could not be dressed away or minimize the absolute presence of another person made manifest. She set the coat over the back of her chair and sat with her hands in her lap and let him turn around and see. He turned around. He stood with the kettle in his hand and he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had no previous data for. She had seen Julian moved before, rarely and quietly, in the manner of a man for whom emotion was a private and somewhat inconvenient reality, but she had not seen anything like this. It was not tenderness exactly. Not yet. It was something prior to tenderness recognition, as though some part of him had been waiting for a fact to arrive and was only now receiving it. He set the kettle down. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her and she looked up at him, and he did not ask, just extended one hand with the same contained, careful quality of someone who understood they had not been given permission for anything. She took his hand, placed it against the side of her stomach. The baby kicked, one solid, definitive kick directly into his palm. She watched his face. Julian Ashworth, who had navigated hostile acquisitions and SEC investigations, and 17 years of building an empire from a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor into the second-largest private healthcare conglomerate on the West Coast, went completely, absolutely still. "She does that," Nora said softly. "When she wants someone to know she's there." He said nothing. His hand stayed where it was. After a long moment, he pulled a chair out, sat down beside her, and kept his palm on her stomach, and neither of them said anything for a while. The kettle boiled. The rain continued. The city went about its December business 7 floors below. Later, the tea steeping the coats hung up the hour, moving past 11. She asked him, "How did you find me tonight?" "Thomas has had the PI's file since this afternoon. We flew in at 4. I knew you worked at a shop on Burnside. I knew your shift ended at 7. A pause. "I stood across the street and waited. For 3 hours. For 3 hours. She thought about that. About the particular quality of a 3-hour wait in the Portland rain in December, for a man who had spent 7 months being told that what he was waiting for no longer existed. "Julian," she looked at her tea, "I have to ask you something." "Then ask." "Did you know I was still pregnant before Thomas called this afternoon? Did some part of you know and you didn't? Did you not come find me because you weren't sure, or because you were sure and you were—" "I didn't know." His voice was quiet, absolute. "I believed you." I believed the loss. I believed the miscarriage. I believed all of it. Because you are not a person who lies easily, and because I knew you well enough to know the grief was real. It was. He stopped. I just didn't know what you were grieving. She nodded, looked at the table. I was wrong, he said. Not to look for you, I was wrong. You respected what you thought I wanted. I was wrong, he said again. And this time there was something under it, not quite anger, but the feeling adjacent to anger that comes from having believed the wrong thing for too long. I should have looked. I know you said you wanted to leave the marriage. I know you said it was over. I should have looked anyway. Not to change your mind, not to pursue you, just to know. Just to know you were safe. She didn't have an answer to that, because he wasn't wrong and she wasn't right, and the 7 months between them were filled with decisions that had made sense individually and only became visible as a pattern when you looked at all of them together. That was the thing about the choices you made in fear. They had their own internal logic airtight at the time, and it was only afterward in safety that you could see what they had cost. What happens tomorrow? She said. Tomorrow I fly to Seattle and speak to Diane. He poured more tea. Thomas stays here. You don't have to. Thomas stays here, he repeated, and the flatness in his voice was not negotiable, and she did not push it. And after, he was quiet for a moment. After depends on a number of things. He looked at her steadily. But I would like if you're willing to be here for whatever comes next, whatever that looks like, whatever you need it to look like. She thought about those last 7 months, the prenatal appointments alone, the ultrasound room, the sound of a heartbeat in a room that smelled of antiseptic, the 45 minutes on the edge of a hotel bathtub. She thought about his hand on her stomach and the baby kicking directly into his palm, as though she had been waiting for exactly this. I'm not ready to, she started. I know. I'm not saying, I know Nora. He said her name like it was something he'd kept in a drawer and was now carefully taking out. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to let me be here. That's all. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she had married and run from and never stopped loving even when she was most afraid of the world he carried with him. She thought about Diane and the PI's file and the specific calculation of a woman who had looked at an unborn child and seen a threat to manage. You can stay tonight, she said. I don't want to be alone. He nodded, matter of fact. All right, but we're talking about the sleeping arrangement. I want the side by the window. Something fractional, barely there, moved in the corner of his mouth. You always wanted the side by the window? I always wanted the side by the window. He got up and started moving the extra pillow. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him. And outside the rain continued reliable and indifferent the way Portland rain always was. And somewhere in the middle of her chest, she felt the specific, terrifying sensation of something that had been very tightly closed, just beginning to give. Later in the dark, lying on the far side of the bed, with the window and its city light view above her, she heard his breathing, even out, in the careful, controlled way of a person pretending to sleep before they actually achieve it. She had always known that tell. She stared at the ceiling. Julian, she said quietly in case he was awake. She kicks more in the evenings, in case you wanted to know. A pause. I wanted to know, he said. She closed her eyes. 7 months. It did not undo in a single night. Nothing that real ever did. But there was something in the dark of that room. The rain outside the city below, the man in the bed beside her, who had waited 3 hours in the rain and would fly to Seattle tomorrow, and was currently lying very still so as not to disturb her, that felt like the very first shift of something enormous. Not resolution, just the beginning of the possibility of it. The baby turned over. Nora pressed her hand against the curve of her stomach and whispered so low it might have been a thought. It's okay. He's here. End hook. Plus part 1. She woke at 5:50 to the sound of Julian on a phone call. This was not surprising. Julian had been starting his mornings with phone calls for as long as she had known him, a habit born of the time zone differences inherent in running a company with operations from Portland to Philadelphia, and one that she had in the early years of their marriage found easy to accommodate, and in the later years found increasingly difficult not to take personally. It was not that he was inconsiderate, it was that the phone was for Julian a continuation of consciousness rather than an interruption of it. He woke up thinking, and the phone was simply the instrument through which those thoughts traveled outward. She lay still and listened. He was in the other room. She could hear the low register of his voice through the bedroom door. Not the words, just the cadence, that particular executive shorthand of someone who expected to be understood without the burden of full sentences. She had missed that sound in a way she hadn't expected to miss it. Not the specific conversations, which were about things she never had full context for, but the texture of it. The presence of another person's voice in the early morning before the day had fully arranged itself. She got up slowly with the careful choreography of late pregnancy and went to the bathroom. When she emerged 20 minutes later, showered and in the spare clothes Thomas had brought up from the car last night, at her request a bag she'd packed in the bookshop's back room when she'd gone back for her things at 9 o'clock, while Julian was making calls, he was in the kitchen again, and the phone call was over and there was coffee. "You don't drink coffee," he said. "But I didn't know if that was still true." "It's still true. She doesn't like it." She touched her stomach absently. "Dr. Pham says half a cup is fine, but I found out around week 16 that even half a cup makes her very opinionated for the rest of the afternoon." Julian looked at her with an expression she recognized. He was filing information, storing it in whatever internal system he used to keep track of the things that mattered. She had watched him do it in business meetings, in family dinners, in conversations that seemed casual, until you noticed how precisely he could recall them afterward. "I made tea," he said. "I see that." She sat. He sat across from her. Between them, the kitchen table and 2 cups, and the particular charged quiet of a morning after a night neither of them had slept entirely through. "What time is your flight?" she asked. 8:15. He looked at his watch, the plain steel one she noticed, not the dress watch he wore to board meetings. "Thomas will be here before I leave." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He met her eyes. "I want to." She wrapped both hands around her tea and looked out the window. The sky was still dark, but the city below was beginning to stir a few headlights, the distant movement of early delivery trucks, the first suggestion of a morning that would arrive gray and functional and probably damp. "What are you going to say to her?" she asked. "I'm going to show her the file." His voice was measured, careful. "And I'm going to give her the chance to explain herself before I take any formal action." "That's generous." "It's not generous, it's methodical." He turned his cup in a slow circle on the table. "I've worked alongside Diane for 6 years. She built the Strategic Operations Division. She is in many respects better at certain parts of this business than I am. I'm not going to act from anger if I don't have to. Anger in these situations is expensive." "She threatened your daughter." "Yes." His voice did not change. "Which is why I'm flying there in person rather than having a lawyer send a letter." She looked at him. Sometimes often she forgot that Julian's containment was not absence of feeling. It was something more like compression. The feeling was there. It was simply held under pressure so severe that it showed itself only in the precision of his language, in the very particular quietness of certain words. "Threatened your daughter." He had said it flatly, without emphasis, and somehow that made it worse. "I've been thinking," she said, "about Chloe." "Chloe, that's her name." She had told no one until this moment, had kept it in her own head for 4 months, the name she'd arrived at week 25, lying on the narrow couch in her Alberta Arts District apartment, with her feet up on a pillow and a bowl of crackers on her chest, watching the ceiling. "I decided around month 6. I know you should have had. I know we should have discussed it. But I needed something to call her, something that was hers." He was quiet for a moment. "Chloe, if you hate it." "I don't hate it." He said the name again quietly to himself more than to her. "Chloe." She watched him let it settle, watched him with that filing information expression place it somewhere. "It's a good name," she exhaled. They finished their tea in something that was not quite silence and not quite conversation. A middle space that particular morning after quality of 2 people who have said more in one night than they usually say in a month and are now resting in the aftermath of their own honesty. Through the window, Portland was slowly lightening from black to a preliminary reluctant gray. At 7:15, Thomas knocked. Julian stood put on his coat, straightened his collar with the automatic precision of someone who had been dressing for authority for a long time. He picked up his phone. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Nora." She looked up. "I need to ask you something before I go." "Then ask." "When I come back tonight, and I am coming back tonight, is there somewhere else you'd rather be than here? Somewhere that feels safer to you? Another city or—" "No." The answer surprised her with its immediacy. She sat with it for a moment, confirmed it, said it again more quietly. "No, here's fine." He nodded, looked at her for one more moment. "All right." He left. She sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of tea and listened to the door close and the elevator arrive and the building settle back into its morning quiet. Thomas had set himself up near the entry with a tablet and a professionalism that made him functionally invisible. She placed both hands on her stomach. "He'll be back," she said to Chloe. "He's coming back tonight." The baby moved, not the usual kick, something slower, longer, the full body roll that meant she was shifting position, making herself comfortable in the arrangement of the world as she currently understood it. "Yeah," Nora said softly. "Me too." Thomas Reed had a particular way of occupying a room without appearing to occupy it. Nora had noticed this during the 3 years of her marriage. He had a talent for becoming part of the architecture, for being present in the way that furniture was present, registered, but not consciously observed. He would stand near a doorway with a tablet and a cup of coffee and conduct his work with such quiet competence that after an hour you forgot he was there, and then he would say something in a low voice and you would be startled all over again. He said something in a low voice at 10:15. He landed safely. Meeting with Ms. Ashworth is scheduled for 11. Nora looked up from the book she had not been reading. "Thank you. He wanted you to know." She set the book down, looked out the window at Portland, assembling itself in a gray, purposeful December morning. The rain had gentled into something more like mist, the way it sometimes did mid-morning, as though the sky was pausing to reconsider. "Thomas." She turned. "How long have you known it was Diane?" He looked at her from across the room. His expression was the professional neutral that she had always read as neither confirmation nor denial. Then slowly he set the tablet on the side table and said, "I had a strong suspicion from the 4th week. I had a working theory by the 2nd month." "And you told Julian?" "I told Mr. Ashworth that I believed the breach was internal and that the access pattern pointed to executive-level credentials. I told him that the pool of individuals with the necessary access was small." A pause. "I did not say her name because I did not have documentation. I was unwilling to make an accusation of that magnitude on the basis of pattern recognition alone." Nora understood this. It was the same logic she had applied from the other side of the problem. Not enough certainty to act, too much suspicion to ignore. "He spent 6 months knowing something was wrong and not knowing who." Yes. She thought about what that must have been like for Julian, who operated in a world of verified information, who built strategies on confirmed data, who had an almost constitutional aversion to acting on incomplete intelligence. To know there was a threat somewhere in his inner circle and not be able to name it, that would have been for him a specific and relentless torment. "You protected him by not telling him," she said. Thomas met her eyes. "I thought I was. In hindsight, I'm not certain I made the right call." She picked up her book again, did not read it. At 11:45, her phone, the personal one, the one Julian had texted last night from a new number she'd saved under his name without thinking about it, vibrated on the table. She looked at the screen. It was a 3-word message, confirmed. Flying back. And then after a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, all of it. She set the phone down, picked it up, set it down again. "He confirmed it," she told Thomas. Thomas nodded, once the way he always did when information arrived that he had already accounted for. Julian came back at 4:15. He was wearing the same coat. He looked precisely as he had when he'd left that morning. Same collar, same posture, same controlled surface, except that there was something different in the quality of his stillness. She had learned over 3 years to differentiate between Julian's stillnesses the way a musician learns to distinguish between rests of different lengths. The stillness he was carrying now was the kind that came after the completion of something difficult. Not relief exactly. More like the settling that follows the application of sustained pressure. He put his bag down. He accepted the glass of water Thomas handed him. He sat across from Nora in the chair by the window and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "She didn't deny it," he said. Nora had known it was coming, had known since the 3-word text, but there was still something vertiginous about hearing it spoken aloud. "What did she say?" "She said she'd made a business decision." That's the phrase she used, a business decision. His voice was even. Deliberately carefully, even the way it became when he was managing something that he did not intend to let manage him. She said she'd looked at the inheritance structure, assessed the risk to her position, and determined that the most efficient resolution was to ensure the situation resolved itself. That was her language. The situation. The situation being our child. Yes, Nora sat with this. She looked at the middle distance where the window met the building across the street, and she thought about Diane Ashworth, the intelligence, the precision, the genuine warmth she'd occasionally shown during family dinners, the advice about patience and trust that Nora had actually believed. She thought about a woman who could sit across a dinner table from her nephew's pregnant wife and simultaneously be orchestrating the machinery of that wife's disappearance. "What did you do?" she asked. "I told her she has 30 days to arrange a transfer of her board seat and executive role. I told her I would be providing a full account of her actions to the company's legal counsel, who will determine whether any of her conduct rises to the level of criminal threat. I told her that if she contacts you, contacts anyone connected to you, or interferes in any way with my ability to be present for the birth and upbringing of my daughter, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me without the consideration I extended to her today." He paused. "And I told her she is no longer welcome in my home." Nora looked at him. How did she respond? "She said I was throwing away the most important relationship in my professional life for a woman who'd abandoned me and a child she'd hidden from me. And, a long pause. I told her that if she genuinely believed that she had never understood me at all." He turned the glass in his hands. "She's known me for 31 years. She watched me build this company. She knew better than almost anyone how I operated and what I valued and what I was capable of, and she still thought I could be managed through a pregnant woman's fear." He set the glass down. "That more than anything else is what I can't reconcile." She understood that. The betrayal was layered. There was the act itself, and then underneath it, the assumption that had made the act seem viable, the belief that Julian's priorities were so entirely fixed on the company that a threat to his family could be dismissed as manageable collateral damage. That Diane had believed this said something about what she had seen or thought she'd seen for 31 years. "She was wrong about you," Nora said quietly. "She was wrong about what I would choose." He looked at her. "She was not entirely wrong about who I was when she made the assessment. 6 months ago, I was a man who was better at running a company than being a husband. I can say that plainly. I don't say it to excuse what she did, but I can't pretend her read of me was entirely without basis. This honesty, this particular willingness to sit in an uncomfortable truth without either dismissing it or weaponizing it was one of the things she had always loved most about him, and one of the things that had most often infuriated her because it made it harder to be straightforwardly angry. "What happens to the company now?" she said. "Marcus Holt, my CFO, takes interim control of daily operations. He's been effectively running the finance division independently for 3 years. He knows the company well enough to hold it steady while I'm," he paused, "reorganizing my priorities. You're not stepping away from everything. Not immediately, not entirely, but I'm stepping back from the daily operational intensity that has been consuming me for the last 4 years." He looked at her directly. "I bought a company, and then I let the company buy me back. I understand that now. I'm not going to pretend it happened differently or that you didn't warn me. I didn't warn you. I asked you once whether you thought we were okay, and you said yes. And I believed it when I said it, which tells you something about my self-awareness at the time." She looked at the window. Outside, the mist had thickened again into proper rain. "Julian." She chose her next words carefully. "I need to ask you something that's been in my head all day." "Then ask it." "If Diane's people always knew where I was, if she had a PI filing location reports, why didn't anything happen 7 months? She knew I was in Portland, she knew my address, my workplace, my schedule. Why didn't she? I've been thinking about that since I landed." He leaned back slightly. "I think she believed the situation had resolved itself. You'd disappeared. I believed the pregnancy was gone, and the threat to her position had effectively neutralized without her having to take any direct action. The PI was insurance, a way of keeping you visible in case you surfaced publicly or tried to make contact. She wasn't watching you to hurt you, she was watching you to make sure you stayed gone." "And when I didn't stay gone? When you found me?" "Then the whole architecture of her calculation collapsed." He paused. "I think she knew when I called her this morning to set up the meeting that it was over. She was composed when I arrived. She had the files ready not to defend herself, I think, but because she'd already decided that if I came to her with what I knew, she'd rather own it than be caught denying it. That's almost admirable. That's Diane." Something moved across his face, not quite grief, but the complex feeling adjacent to it that comes from losing a version of someone you thought you knew. She has always been more capable of clarity about outcomes than about the ethics of how she arrives at them. Nora watched him. This was the other side of the man she'd married, not the compressed emotion, not the professional armor, but the thinker. The man who could not help but understand the people who wronged him, who analyzed motive with the same dispassion he brought to market analysis, who could be genuinely quietly devastated by someone's actions while simultaneously articulating exactly why those actions had seemed rational from the inside. She had fallen in love with that mind before she'd fallen in love with anything else. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked at her as though the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. "Functionally. That's not what I asked." A pause. Longer than most of his pauses. "No," he said finally. "Not entirely. I'll be fine. But right now tonight, no." He looked at his hands. "She's the only family I have. Had. I don't know what tense applies." He said it without self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. "My parents both died before I was 30. There's no one else. And she, even knowing what she did, even understanding all of it, she was there. For a long time, she was the person who remembered the early years with me, who remembered what we were building toward before it became something we were just sustaining." He stopped. "And she was willing to threaten a child to protect her piece of it. I don't know what to do with that." Nora got up from her chair. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the couch, close but not touching, and she said, "You don't have to do anything with it tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight you came back," she said. "Tonight she's safe, and I'm safe, and you know what happened and who did it, and you handled it. That's enough for one day." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his hand palm up on the cushion between them, not reaching, just offering, and she placed hers on top of it. They sat like that while the rain came down outside, and the city moved through its early evening routines, and Chloe turned over in the way she did when Nora was still and calm, long, slow movements that felt like contentment. And Nora thought, this is what it could have been. All along, under everything, this quiet, honest side-by-side thing. This was what the marriage had been missing. Not love. Love had never been the problem. Just this two people sitting together in difficulty instead of managing their difficulties separately and presenting each other with the composed results. "Tell me about the house," she said eventually. He turned to look at her. "What house?" "Thomas mentioned last night that you have a property outside the city, that you've had it for a while." She kept her voice neutral, curious, not accusatory. "He didn't mean to tell me. It slipped out when he was explaining the security plan." Julian was quiet for a moment. "I bought it 2 years ago," he said. "About 8 months after we were married." He paused. Do you remember the summer you said you wanted to move somewhere with a garden? You said it once, almost as a throwaway. We were at a restaurant in Belltown, and someone at the next table was talking about moving to the suburbs, and you said you thought that sounded like a real life. She remembered. She had not thought at the time that he was listening. "I went to look at properties the following week," he said. "Not to tell you, not yet. I wanted to have something concrete before I brought it to you, something real rather than theoretical, because I knew if I told you I was thinking about it and then it never materialized, it would be worse than if I'd said nothing at all." He turned the glass in his hands. "And then the acquisitions in Q3 started, and the East Coast expansion, and I kept thinking after this quarter, after this deal, after this one transition. And then you were pregnant, and I thought now it's finally time. And then I left, and then you left." He set the glass down precisely. "I drove out there about 2 weeks after. I don't know why. The house was empty. No one living in it. The property management company keeping it maintained. I stood on the back porch and looked at the water, and I thought..." He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought I did everything in the wrong order." He said it simply, without drama. "I built the thing I thought would come after and neglected the thing that was supposed to come first." She looked at him for a long moment. Can I see it?" she asked. He turned. "The house?" "Yes." He studied her face with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. "When?" "Tomorrow, or whenever you think it's safe enough." She paused. "I've been in Portland for 7 months. In an apartment, and then above a restaurant, and then in a one-bedroom near the bookshop. I would like to be somewhere that feels permanent for a little while. Even if it's only temporary, permanent." She pressed a hand against her stomach. "Chloe deserves a room that isn't a fold-out couch." Julian looked at her hand on her stomach, and then at her face, and then said, "The house has a room on the 2nd floor, east-facing. I had it furnished when I bought the place." She stared at him. "A child's room," he said quietly. "Empty. I had it furnished because I thought eventually..." He looked at the window. "It's been sitting there empty for 2 years." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, That's either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the most romantic. Something shifted in his face, that fractional, barely there movement at the corner of his mouth that she had spent 3 years learning to recognize as the thing he did instead of smiling when he didn't have permission yet to smile. Possibly both, he said. Possibly both, she agreed. Outside, the Portland rain continued reliable as gravity, and somewhere in the warm, insulated space of the suite, something that had been very careful and very provisional began quietly to settle. She called Dr. Pham that evening to explain that she'd be transitioning to a new care provider in the coming weeks and to thank her. Dr. Pham, who was a woman of considerable professional discretion and had spent 12 years building a practice on the principle of non-judgment, simply said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." It was such a perfect thing to say that Nora cried a little after she hung up, not from sadness, but from the accumulation of small kindnesses she'd received from strangers over the past 7 months, and had never had adequate room to feel. Thomas from across the room pretended not to notice. Julian from the kitchen, where he was doing something with pasta that smelled unexpectedly good, said, "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said. She was kind to me. Then she made the right call. It was such a simple thing to say exactly the right thing, without ceremony or excess, that she had to look away for a moment and look at the ceiling and remind herself to be appropriately cautious about a man who knew intuitively when to say the exactly right thing. The pasta turned out to be better than expected. "You cooked," she said. "I followed instructions. It's not the same thing. It tastes like the same thing. Don't tell anyone I have a reputation." She laughed. For the first time in a very long while, she laughed at something he said, and the laugh felt like the recovery of a sound she'd forgotten she owned. He looked at her across the table, not smiling but present in a way that was better than smiling, and she thought, "We are not where we were. We are not even close to where we need to be. There are months of difficulty ahead, conversations that will be hard, a Diane-shaped wound in the architecture of his life that will take a long time to close, and a trust between us that needs to be rebuilt the same way houses are rebuilt after damage, carefully one verified piece at a time. But this, she thought, this moment, this table, and this pasta, and this man, and the small person currently conducting aerobics inside her ribcage, this is where it starts." End. Part 2. Later that night, after Thomas had taken his post in the outer room and the dinner things were cleared, Julian sat on the couch with his laptop open and the low light of the city coming through the window, and Nora sat across from him in the armchair with a blanket over her legs and a prenatal book she had read twice already. And they existed in the same room with a naturalness that had taken them during their actual marriage nearly a year to achieve. "I have a question," she said without looking up from the book. "Then ask it. When Marcus takes over interim control, all of that, what does that actually mean for your day-to-day?" Realistically, he closed the laptop partway. "It means I stop being the person who makes final calls on operational decisions. Marcus escalates to me for strategic matters, mergers, major regulatory issues, significant capital deployment, but the daily running of the company is his. I'm effectively a senior advisor with a title rather than a functioning executive. That's a significant reduction in control." "Yes. You've been in full operational control since you were 32. "Yes." She looked up from the book. "How are you going to handle that?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was something she had always respected about him. He did not give easy answers to hard questions. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "I expect poorly for the first few months. I'll probably call Marcus twice a day at minimum and have to actively stop myself from calling a third time. And he'll probably let you. He's too polite not to. It's one of his weaknesses." A pause. "But I think the thing that kept me so embedded in the daily operation was the absence of something else to be embedded in. I am not temperamentally a person who idles well. I need to be engaged, invested, useful. The company gave me all of that." He looked at the window. "I think a daughter might serve some of those same needs. Differently. More loudly, probably." She smiled. "Much more loudly. I've been told the early months are particularly instructive in terms of learning to function under sleep deprivation." "Who told you that?" "I read several books on the subject. There is a surprising amount of written material on newborn care. Someone has strong feelings about sleep schedules. Multiple someones, they all disagree. That I also discovered." He looked at her. "I highlighted the areas of consensus." She stared at him. "You highlighted a parenting book." I highlighted 3 parenting books and cross-referenced the recommendations. She put her own book down. She looked at this man, this very serious, very particular, occasionally exasperating man who had responded to the discovery that he was going to be a father by treating it with the same methodical rigor he brought to corporate due diligence. And she felt something move in her chest that she could not have named precisely, but that had something to do with the word safe. Not safe in the way the suite was safe with Thomas at the door and the security measures and the distance from Diane's reach. Safe in the way of being known. Julian, she said. She's going to love you. He looked up from the laptop. Something passed through his face, unguarded private, the kind of expression he would have controlled if he'd been faster. Then it settled into something quieter. I'll try to deserve it, he said. You already do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the laptop again and returned to whatever he'd been reading, and she returned to her book, and the room held its comfortable quiet. And outside Portland continued its December rain, and Chloe opinionated about most things consistent about this, kicked 3 times in her unhurried rhythmic way, as if to say, I know exactly where I am. And for the first time in 7 months, Nora thought so do I. They drove to the house on a Thursday. Julian had spent the previous 2 days managing the operational handoff to Marcus from the suite's kitchen table, which he did with a thoroughness that Nora could only describe as comprehensive to the point of ritual color-coded document folders. A 72-page transition brief that he had apparently prepared in the weeks before flying to Portland, and a 6-hour call with his legal counsel, during which she retreated to the bedroom with noise-canceling headphones and a podcast about British baking competitions, which was sufficiently calming and completely removed from her actual life. Thomas drove. Julian sat beside her in the back seat. The route took them south along the Willamette, through neighborhoods that shifted gradually from the dense particular energy of the city to something wider and greener and more deliberately still. The rain had paused that morning for the first time in what felt like weeks, leaving the sky a clean-washed gray and the tree branches along the river road shining with residual wet. Nora watched the landscape change and tried not to build expectations. This was a thing she had learned over a marriage and a departure and 7 months of managing her own emotional states without assistance that hope was safest when it was provisional. When you left it a little unfixed and permitted it to shift when the actual shape of things became clear. She was 31 years old and pregnant, and the man she'd left and returned to was sitting beside her, having transitioned in the space of 48 hours from distant CEO to attentive prospective father, and none of it was settled and all of it still required verification. She was trying very hard not to feel the full weight of how much she wanted this to work. The house appeared at the end of a private road through a gate that Thomas opened with a code on his phone. It was not what she had constructed in her mind. She had expected something in Julian's aesthetic register. The clean lines and expensive minimalism of the Seattle penthouse, all glass and steel, and the kind of intentional sparseness that signaled a person who controlled their environment. She had expected something that looked curated, managed, professionally appointed for an owner who visited rarely and left no traces. What she saw instead was a house that looked like a home someone had been thinking about for a very long time. It was cedar and stone with a wide covered porch that ran the length of the front face and a roofline that came down in long, generous slopes. The landscaping was simple, mature trees, a cleared lawn running down to the edge of what she could now see was a small lake, not large enough to be impressive, just large enough to be beautiful. And along the near edge of the water, a wooden dock that extended about 15 feet over the surface. The house sat on its property with the particular settled quality of something that belonged there, as though it had been grown rather than built. She opened her car door before Thomas had fully stopped. "Careful," Julian said. "I'm fine." She was already navigating out one hand on the door frame, the other at her stomach, moving with the careful deliberateness that had become her standard operating procedure at 29 weeks. She stood on the gravel drive and looked at the house and felt something she could not immediately identify move through her chest. Julian came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He looked at the house too, the way you look at something you haven't seen in a while and are not entirely certain still belongs to you. "You built this for a family you didn't have yet," she said. "I bought it for one." "Same thing." He looked at her. "Maybe." She walked toward the front door. Inside it was warm. The property management company had turned the heat on the day before at Thomas's request, and it smelled of wood and clean cold and a slight cedar sweetness from the walls. The ceilings were high, the windows tall, the furniture real, a couch that had visible impressions from use, bookshelves built into the walls of the main room, a kitchen table with 6 chairs that had the grain of something made to last. She moved through the rooms slowly, the way you do when you're learning a space rather than passing through it. The kitchen was large and faced the lake. The living room had a fireplace stone with a pile of split logs beside it and a cast iron rack. A hallway led to the downstairs bedroom, a study, a small bathroom with a deep tub. The stairs were wooden and broad and curved at the bottom. She went up. Julian followed, not crowding her, staying one step back on the staircase in case she needed a steadying hand. She had not said she needed one. He had not offered. He was simply there. The second floor had 3 rooms and a sitting area with a window that looked directly over the lake. The master bedroom was at the rear, substantial, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bed she guessed was an emperor. A bathroom attached with the deep silence of good construction. She walked to the end of the hall. The last door was the nursery. She put her hand on the knob, looked at him over her shoulder. He met her gaze without any particular expression, just present, just waiting. She opened the door. It was a room of quiet intention. The walls were painted a soft, warm white, not stark, not clinical, the kind of white that held light gently. Against the far wall was a crib solid wood in a natural finish, the kind of furniture made to last decades rather than years. Beside it, a low dresser with wide drawers. A rocking chair in the corner by the window plain, well made, the kind of thing that invited sitting. The window faced east. Morning light, she thought. It would have morning light. She walked to the crib and put her hand on the rail. "How long has this been here?" she said. 2 years. She looked at the chair, at the dresser, at the absolute stillness of a room that had been arranged for a person who didn't yet exist, and then simply waited. 2 years, she said again. "I told you, I did things in the wrong order." His voice was quiet. He was standing in the doorway. "I kept the room because I couldn't make myself not. Even after you left. Even after I thought the pregnancy was, I kept it, because getting rid of it would have required me to accept something I wasn't prepared to accept." She turned around. He looked at her from the doorway. This man who had crossed a city in the rain and waited 3 hours on a wet sidewalk and flown home to face a cousin who had calculated against his own child and come back that same evening and made pasta and highlighted parenting books, and she thought, how did I leave this person? How did I look at this person and decide that leaving was the only option? She knew the answer. The answer was Diane and the fear and the particular impossible logic of a threat that had arrived at a moment of maximum vulnerability. The answer was that she had been 29 weeks pregnant and alone and terrified, and she had made the best decision available to her at the time. But standing here now in this room he had kept for 2 years against the possibility of hope, she felt for the first time the full weight of what both of them had lost. "Julian." Her voice was steadier than she expected. He came into the room. She moved the 2 steps toward him and put her arms around him, around the formal posture, around the charcoal coat, around all of it, and she felt the specific quality of his stillness when something caught him off guard. Then his arms came around her, careful with her stomach, careful with her entirely, and she stood in the room. They'd both grieved in separate places, and she let herself feel it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I've said it. I know it isn't. I know." His hand moved to the back of her head, just resting. "I know." They stood like that for a while in the east-facing room with the crib and the waiting chair, while the December light came through the window and Chloe moved between them, slow and certain, making her presence known. She did not call it moving in. She called it staying for a while, which was honest enough. Her belongings from Portland were still in Thomas's car, which was still in the driveway, and she had made no formal decision about any of what came next. She was staying for a while in a house with a man she was not yet ready to call anything specific, because the language for what they were had not caught up to the reality of what they were becoming. Thomas brought her things inside without ceremony. Julian made dinner again, better this time. Something with salmon that suggested he had actually been practicing rather than simply following instructions. She sat at the kitchen table with her feet up on the opposite chair. He had placed a pillow there without being asked, without comment, and she watched him navigate the kitchen with the focused determination of a person learning a new skill, and she thought about all the dinners in the Seattle penthouse that had been delivered or catered or consumed in brief intervals between commitments. "You're actually enjoying this," she said. "Don't tell anyone." "Who would I tell?" "Marcus." He'd find it hilarious. She smiled. "Tell me about Marcus." He turned from the stove. "Why, Because in 3 years of marriage, I've heard his name approximately 400 times and met him twice. I'd like to know who's running your company. So Julian told her about Marcus Holt, and she listened, and Chloe kicked through the salmon and the rice and the conversation and the first hour in the new house that felt tentatively and with appropriate caution like the beginning of something sustainable. Afterward, the dishes done, he washed. She dried a division, arrived at naturally without discussion. They sat on the covered porch in the early evening, cold, bundled in separate blankets looking at the lake. The surface was still. A pair of ducks moved near the dock in unhurried circles. I want to find a new doctor, she said. Someone out here or in the nearest town. I need prenatal appointments, and I want you there if you're willing. I'm willing. And a birth plan. We need to talk about that. We'll talk about it. And the name, Chloe Ashworth or Chloe Callahan or Ashworth. He said it without hesitation. She's ours. She should have both of us in her name. She looked at him from the other chair. What? He said. You just said ours. She is ours. I know. She stopped, looked back at the lake. The ducks had settled near the dock, unhurried, completely at home. I'm still getting used to the plural. Take your time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, his expression quiet and composed and entirely certain, and she thought, that is not a performative statement. That is not a reassurance deployed to manage a difficult moment. That is a man stating a fact he has already verified internally. I'm not going anywhere. She had heard those words from people before, and they had meant different things at different times. From Julian in this cold December evening on a porch above a winter lake, with a daughter moving in the space between them, and a house that had been waiting 2 years for exactly this, they meant precisely what they said. She wrapped her blanket tighter. Tell me about the lake, she said. What's in it? Largemouth bass, mostly. Some trout along the deeper channel near the far bank. He paused. I've been out here exactly once since I bought the place. Early spring, 2 years ago. I sat on the dock for 2 hours and didn't catch anything. Terrible. I'm a good investor and a mediocre fisherman. You can't have everything. Chloe will want to fish. Then she'll teach me. She looked at him. This man, this very particular and unexpectedly funny man, who had been sitting across from her in various configurations for 3 years and would never, she was beginning to understand entirely. Stop surprising her. Okay, she said. He turned. Okay, what? Okay, I'll stay. Not for a while. Just okay. He looked at her for a long moment. The lake was still. The ducks had tucked their heads down. Good, he said simply. It was exactly the right word. End part 3. The days settled, not immediately. Nothing in this situation was immediate, but gradually the way warmth settles into a room that's been cold for a long time. There's first the awareness of it, and then the adjustment to it, and then finally the moment when it stops feeling like a surprise and starts feeling like the established temperature of things. Nora found a new obstetrician on the 4th day. Dr. Renata Sullivan, a small, compact woman in her early 50s who ran a practice out of the town 12 minutes away, and had, according to the 3 online reviews, Nora had been able to find a reputation for being direct to the point of occasional bluntness and extraordinarily good in the delivery room. Julian had been present at the first appointment, sitting in the chair beside the examination table with a legal pad on which he had written in his small, precise handwriting 11 questions. Dr. Sullivan had looked at the legal pad. Then she had looked at Julian. Then she had said, "You're the father, I take it." Yes. First baby. Yes. Are all 11 of those questions about what I'd consider statistically normal 3rd trimester concerns? Julian had looked at the pad. Mostly. There are 2 at the end that are more specific to, "Let me examine my patient first," Dr. Sullivan had said, "and I'll answer all 11, including the 2 at the end." Nora had looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Julian had capped his pen. Dr. Sullivan had answered all 11, including the 2 at the end, without condescension or impatience. And as they left the office, Julian had said, "She's good." "She is," Nora agreed. She handled the questions well. Most people would have handled 11 questions. Some people get defensive about thoroughness. "That's true," she said. "It's one of your more endearing qualities." He looked at her sideways. "I said endearing," she clarified. Yes. The evenings became their time. After dinner, Julian cooked most nights with increasing confidence, having apparently discovered that the same methodical focus that made him effective at corporate strategy also made him good at following complex recipes. They would sit on the porch if the weather allowed or in the living room if it didn't, and they would talk. About Chloe. Mostly the birth plan. The pediatrician Thomas had researched the sleep philosophy Julian had developed after cross-referencing his 3 highlighted books, and which Nora had agreed to attempt with the explicit caveat that she reserved the right to abandon it entirely at the 3-week mark. But also about other things, about the marriage. What had worked, what hadn't, what they would do differently. These conversations were sometimes difficult and always honest, conducted with the particular care of 2 people who had already been through the worst and understood that pretending otherwise would only rebuild the same structures that had failed them. "I needed more of you," she said one night. Not accusatory, just true. Not more time necessarily, just more of the actual person. Less of the executive. "I know." He looked at the fire. "I think I'd been the executive for so long that I wasn't sure the other person was still accessible. I'm not certain I knew how to be present in the way you needed without it feeling like a reduction of myself." "It's not a reduction. I know that now." He paused. "It took losing you to understand that the person I was being wasn't actually larger or more complete because he was professionally formidable. He was just more defended." She looked at him. "That's very self-aware. I read a book about that too." She laughed a real laugh, the kind that caught her off guard, and he looked pleased in the way of a person who is not accustomed to making people laugh and finds the discovery quietly gratifying. They were not yet what they had been, but what they had been had not been enough, and what they were becoming was something truer. Something built from the ground up on honesty and difficulty and the shared knowledge of what it had cost both of them to arrive here. On the 6th evening, she fell asleep on the couch at 9:30. Mid-sentence, the way she sometimes did now that the 3rd trimester fatigue had consolidated into something reliable and total. She woke at 2 in the morning to find a blanket over her, the fire banked low, and Julian asleep in the armchair across the room with his book open on his chest. She looked at him for a long moment in the near dark. Then she said very softly to the room and the fire and the sleeping lake beyond the window, "Okay, I love you. I know that already." She didn't say it to him. Not yet. He was asleep and the timing wasn't right, and there was still a careful, verified path to travel before she was ready to say it to his face. But she let herself feel the full weight of it for the first time since she'd gotten back sitting in the warm room with the man who had highlighted parenting books and waited 3 hours in the rain. It was a very large weight. It felt exactly right. 3 weeks before the due date, Diane called. Nora was in the kitchen when Julian's phone vibrated on the table between them. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and the quality of his stillness changed just fractionally, just for a second. But she had been reading him carefully for long enough to catch it. "It's Diane," he said. "Jen bought us," he said. She watched his face. "You can take it," she said. No." He set the phone face down on the table, watched it vibrate twice more, then stop. "I told her what I required from her. A call without a prior arrangement means she's decided to override that. I'm not rewarding that. She might be calling to apologize. She might be." He turned the phone over and checked a voicemail. He listened to it with the phone held away from his ear volume low. His expression did not change. "What did she say?" Nora set down her tea. "She wants to meet. She says there are things I don't know about the full situation. She says she can explain herself if I give her 30 minutes. He set the phone down. "I've heard this framing before. It's what people say when they want an opportunity to recontextualize something that doesn't benefit from additional context." "Maybe." He looked at her. "Do you want me to meet with her?" It was a genuine question asked with complete seriousness. He was not making the decision for her not presenting a preference and asking for her agreement. He was giving her the actual choice. She thought about it honestly. "Not yet," she said. "After Chloe is born. After we're stable. If she genuinely wants to do something other than relitigate or justify, then yes. I think eventually. But not right now." He nodded, picked up his phone, typed a brief reply. Showed it to her before he sent it. "Not now. After the new year, if you'd like to try to build something honest, I'm willing to discuss it. But that conversation needs to start with you understanding what you did and what it cost. Until then, please respect our boundaries." She read it twice. "Send it," she said. He sent it. The scare came at 37 weeks and 2 days on a Sunday evening in late January. They had been watching something on television, a documentary about migratory birds that Julian had suggested and Nora had agreed to, and that had turned out to be unexpectedly absorbing with a narrator whose careful, unhurried voice was well suited to the late hour. Chloe had been active all evening, more active than usual, the energetic rolling and kicking pattern that Nora associated with the baby being alert and opinionated. She had said so to Julian, who had placed his hand on her stomach and felt the movement, and said, "She has opinions about bird migration," and Nora had said, "She has opinions about everything." And it had been a perfectly ordinary Sunday. And then between one breath and the next, the feeling changed. It was not pain exactly. It was more like pressure, low and insistent, the kind that when you felt it, you thought, oh, this is different. Julian, he looked up from the documentary. She looked at him. I think something might be happening. He was up before the sentence fully arrived. Contractions. I don't know. Something. It's... She stopped as another wave moved through her lower, more definitive than the Braxton Hicks she'd had twice in the previous month. Yes, I think so. How far apart? I've only had 2. All right. He was already moving, phone in hand. Dr. Sullivan's number pulled up the hospital bag that she had packed 2 weeks ago, sitting by the hall closet. I'm calling Dr. Sullivan. Julian. He paused. She's 3 weeks early. She'll be fine. He said it with the particular certainty of a man who has decided something, and she understood in that moment the difference between Julian's certainty as denial and Julian's certainty as choice. He was not telling her there was no reason to be afraid. He was telling her he had decided not to be because one of them needed to be steady, and he was choosing to be that. Okay, she said. He called Dr. Sullivan. The hospital was 40 minutes away at this hour. Julian drove, which was not the plan. The plan, as they had discussed it, was for Thomas to drive while Julian sat with Nora in the back seat. But Thomas was in Seattle for the weekend visiting his sister for the first time in 4 months, and Julian did not call him back. He put Nora in the passenger seat, adjusted the mirror, and drove with the quiet, concentrated focus he brought to everything that mattered. Talk to me, she said during a contraction that was stronger than the last. About something, anything. In the spring, he said, when the lake ice melts, there's a window of about 3 weeks when the bass are in the shallows. Easiest fishing of the year. He checked the mirror, changed lanes. I read that the best time to take a child fishing for the first time is around age 4. By then they have enough patience to hold a rod for more than 45 seconds without getting bored. She'll get bored after 20 seconds. Then we'll try again at 5. Tell me more. The dock needs some boards replaced. I was looking at it last week. The middle section has been weathered. I'll do it in March. He paused. I've never replaced dock boards before. I expect I'll do it wrong the first time. You'll read a book about it. I've already found 3 on the subject. The consensus is mixed. She laughed sharp at first, cutting through a contraction, then softening into something real. And he glanced at her with that fractional expression she had come to love, the almost smile that he offered in moments when he was genuinely pleased with himself. We're almost there, he said. 15 minutes. She pressed her hand against the door and breathed and thought about dock boards and spring fishing and the particular quality of this man's voice in the middle of a January night driving toward the birth of their daughter. Julian, she said, I love you. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks since the night she'd said it to the dark room. She had not been waiting for this specific moment. The moment had simply arrived. I know the timing is Nora. His hand left the steering wheel and found hers on the center console and held it. I know. His voice was rough at the edges. I know. I'm not saying it because of the situation. I know that too. The hospital lights appeared ahead. He made the turn into the emergency entrance with smooth, deliberate precision, and she thought he always did know how to arrive exactly where he was needed. Dr. Sullivan was already there when they came through the doors. She moved through the initial examination with efficient authority, asked questions, and received answers, reviewed the monitoring equipment that the nurses had attached with practiced hands. Julian stood at Nora's side through all of it, not in the way, not hovering, simply there, one hand available whenever Nora needed it. You're in early labor, Dr. Sullivan said. 3 centimeters contractions every 7 minutes. The baby is head down and the fetal heart rate is excellent. She looked at them both over the rims of her reading glasses. She's 3 weeks early, which isn't concerning at 37. Technically full term. She's been ready for a while, I suspect. She has opinions, Julian said. Dr. Sullivan looked at him. I've gathered. She patted Nora's knee. We're going to monitor you both for an hour and see how you progress. If contractions intensify, we move forward. If they plateau, we manage from there. She stood. Any questions? Julian looked at the legal pad he'd brought from the car. Dr. Sullivan looked at the legal pad. Later, Nora said. He can ask them later. The labor that followed was long and in sections very hard. Julian stayed through all of it. He had been prepared, had done the preparation with the same thoroughness he brought to everything but preparation in reality, whereas Nora had warned him they would be not the same thing. The reality was 12 hours of watching the person he loved move through something he could not do for her, could not manage or strategize or mitigate through research. He could only be present and hold the hand that needed holding and say the things that needed saying when she needed them said. Around hour 8, during a contraction that had them both white-knuckled, she said, "Talk. Say something." "You're the strongest person I know," he said immediately. No hesitation, no performance. "You spent 7 months alone protecting her, and then you came back and you trusted me with her and with you, and I know how much that cost you, and every day I'm aware of that, and she is going to know it too. She is going to know exactly who her mother is." Nora did not respond because the contraction did not permit it, but she did not let go of his hand. At 4:47 in the morning, after one final absolute all-of-herself effort, Chloe Ashworth arrived. The sound of her crying filled the room indignant. Definitive, completely certain of her own importance. And Julian, who had been talking quietly to Nora and had not looked away from her face for the last 20 minutes, went very still. Then he looked. Nora watched him. She had been watching his face through all 12 hours, had catalogued every expression, the control, the fear he managed, the steadiness. He chose the fractional moments when something slipped through the professional surface and showed her the man underneath. She had seen all of those. She had not seen this. He looked at their daughter, pink and small and furious and absolutely present, wrapped in the flannel the nurses moved quickly to arrange, and everything he was simply opened, not cracked, not fractured. Opened the way a window opens intentionally, completely, to let something in. "She has your mouth," he said. His voice was barely audible. "She has your ears," Nora said. "God help her," Nora laughed. The nurse placed Chloe against her chest, and Nora felt the weight of her, the specific warm solidity of this small person who had been a sound and a kick and a name and a hope and was now undeniably here, and she thought, "I kept you safe. I did everything wrong and everything right, and I kept you safe, and here you are." Julian sat beside the bed very close. He put one careful finger in Chloe's fist. The fist closed around it immediately, with the absolute confidence of someone who understood that this particular finger was where it was supposed to be. His breath went out of him, long, slow, the release of something held too tightly for too long. "Hi," he said very quietly to the person who had just arrived. "I'm your dad. I'm the one who read all the books." Chloe made a sound. "Yes?" he said. "I know. You have opinions. We're going to get along very well." Nora looked at the two of them, this man she loved and this small, fierce girl they'd made together, in the midst of everything, and she felt something in her chest that she had no word for in any language. Something older than language, probably. Something that had been waiting like the room upstairs in the house by the lake for exactly this. End. Part 4. They stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Julian did not leave. This was not something Nora had asked for, and it was not something she had thought to ask for, and it was precisely what she needed. He slept in the chair beside the bed upright with the same contained discipline he applied to sleeping on transatlantic flights. Not comfortable, not complaining, simply present. He brought her water before she asked for it. He learned to do the newborn swaddle by watching the nurses once and then practicing with focused seriousness until he got it right, which took 4 attempts, and which he completed without audible frustration. Chloe, for her part, had opinions about swaddling. "She keeps breaking the left tuck," Julian said on the 3rd attempt. "Yes," said the nurse, "she does that." "Is there a technique that—" "Some babies don't like swaddling." Julian looked at this information as though it were a gap in his research that he intended to address. "The books. Some babies," the nurse repeated pleasantly, "don't read the books." Nora watched this from the bed. She had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 48. She was sore in ways she had not anticipated and exhausted in ways she had not known were available to her. She was also in some contradictory and complete way entirely content. Thomas arrived on the 2nd afternoon, driving 4 hours from Seattle with a cashmere blanket for Nora, a stuffed rabbit for Chloe, and a sheepish expression suggesting he was aware he had been absent for the main event. "She came 3 weeks early," Julian said without accusation. "I know." Thomas looked at Chloe, who was asleep on Nora's chest in the specific tightly bundled arrangement that Julian had achieved on attempt 6, having apparently determined that the standard swaddle required a modification. She's perfect. She is, Julian agreed with the calm completeness of a man who has fully arrived at a fact. Nora looked at Thomas. How is your sister? She's well, thank you for asking. He sat in the corner chair with his usual quiet efficiency. I gather I missed some excitement. Some? Nora said. Mr. Ashworth called me from the hospital at 5 in the morning. I called you after, Julian said. You would have driven through the night. Oh, yes, Thomas said. I would have. Julian looked at him. Which is why I called after. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, and that was the end of that. On the afternoon before they were discharged, Dr. Sullivan came for a final review, and when satisfied with everything, sat in the chair beside Nora's bed and said, I want to ask you something directly if that's all right. Of course, Nora said. The first appointment you came in with a man who had 11 prepared questions, including 2 about high-risk security protocols for the delivery environment. She folded her hands. I didn't ask then because it wasn't my place. I'm asking now because you're about to leave my care temporarily, and I need to know you're going somewhere safe. We are, Nora said. The situation that required the security protocols has been resolved. Resolved how? Legally and definitively. Dr. Sullivan looked at Julian, who was standing near the window with Chloe. The people who posed a risk have been removed from any position of access, he said. I'll provide full documentation if you need it for the clinical record. She studied him. You're a man who doesn't leave things incomplete. No? All right. She stood. Then I'll see you at the 6-week postpartum appointment. Both of you, I'd imagine. Julian looked at Nora. Both of us, Nora confirmed. They drove home on a February morning that was, for the first time in what felt like months, actually sunny. Not the gray diffuse light that Portland had been providing since November, real sun directional, and specific coming in low through the bare branches of the trees along the river road and painting everything in a pale, tentative gold. It would not last. This was the Pacific Northwest in February, and the sun was a guest rather than a resident, and everyone, including the sun, seemed to understand this. But while it was there, it was beautiful. Nora sat in the back seat with Chloe strapped into the new car seat position so she could see her face. Julian drove. The windows were slightly fogged from the heat inside and the cold outside. She's looking at you, Julian said, watching them in the rearview mirror. She can't really focus yet. She's looking at you, he repeated with the certainty of a man who has reviewed the relevant literature and formed his own conclusion. Nora looked down at her daughter, the dark eyes that were still deciding on their final color. The small nose, the specific expression that Nora had already identified as Chloe's thinking face, which was Julian's thinking face, reduced to 8 pounds and wrapped in a hospital blanket. Hi, she said softly. We're going home. Chloe made a sound that was probably digestive. I know, Nora said. Me too. The house appeared at the end of the private road through the gate, sitting on its property, with that particular quality of belonging that Nora had noticed the first time and had not stopped noticing since. The cedar in the winter morning light. The dock over the still lake. The east-facing window on the second floor, which she knew now was pale, warm white inside with a crib and a rocking chair, and morning light waiting to fall across the floor. Julian stopped the car. They sat for a moment without moving. This is where she grows up, Nora said. Not a question. If that's what you want. She looked at the house, at the dock, at the lake that would have bass in the shallows in spring and would need its middle boards replaced in March, and would be the place where in 4 years or so, a small and extremely opinionated girl would hold a fishing rod for approximately 20 seconds before having thoughts about it. That's what I want, she said. Julian got out of the car. He came around to her door. He opened it and she handed him their daughter, and he held Chloe against his shoulder with both hands while she gathered herself and stood, and the 3 of them walked toward the house in the February sun, which lasted exactly long enough. The first months were not easy. This was something that the books, including Julian's 3 highlighted ones, had been admirably honest about. Newborns do not arrive with a concern for the schedules of the people who wanted them. They arrive with their own set of requirements stated loudly and without ambiguity, and the adults in the situation are required to reorganize themselves entirely around a person who weighs 8 pounds and has at present no insight into the complexity of the reorganization she has caused. Chloe had opinions about feeding. She had opinions about the temperature of the room and the specific angle at which she was held, and the white noise machine that the books had unanimously recommended and that she rejected with a consistent and communicative hostility that Julian found against all probability admirable. "She knows what she wants," he said at 3 in the morning on day 9, rocking her in the chair he'd carried from the nursery to their bedroom on day 3, when it became clear that the nursery to bedroom trip in the middle of the night was non-sustainable. "She gets that from you," Nora said from the bed. "She does not get it from me." The stubbornness about the white noise machine. "I'm not stubborn about—" He stopped, looked at Chloe. "I have strong preferences based on evidence. That's different." "That's what I said." He looked at her over the baby's head. The lamp was on low, and in the soft light he looked tired in a way she had never seen from him before. Not the driven, sustained fatigue of long professional hours, but something more fundamental, and she thought more human. The fatigue of caring so much about something that the caring itself required physical resources. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I have her. You've had every third night shift. I've had the last 4. You had 9 in a row before that." "That's not—" "Nora." His voice was quiet and certain. "Go to sleep. I have her." She went to sleep. This was the new grammar of their life. And she was learning it the way she'd learned everything about this period, incrementally, through repetition, through the gradual accumulation of small verified truths. Julian was, it turned out, excellent at the practical dimensions of early parenthood. Not instinctively, nothing about him had ever been instinctive in the warm, spontaneous sense, but in the particular way of someone who had decided to be excellent at something and had applied their full capacity to the project. He learned Chloe's different cries within the first 2 weeks. He kept a log of feeding times, sleep intervals, and diaper changes in a spreadsheet that he referred to with complete seriousness, and that had by week 3 enabled him to identify a pattern in her wakefulness that had reduced the frequency of the 2 a.m. disruptions by roughly 30%. "You made a spreadsheet," Nora said. "It's a simple one. You made a spreadsheet about our baby. It has 4 columns. She stared at him. "She's sleeping better," he said. "The data supports the approach." She looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at Chloe asleep in the bassinet. She looked at Julian, who was watching her with the expression of a man who is entirely aware that he is being slightly absurd and has decided this is acceptable. "Send me a copy," she said. Diane came at the end of March. She called first, sent a text to Julian formal and brief asking if he would be willing to meet. He showed Nora the message. They discussed it for 2 evenings and 1 morning, and at the end of the 3rd day, Nora said, "Yes, but I'd like to be there." Julian had looked at her. "You don't have to be." "I know. I'd like to be anyway." He had sent the reply. Diane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the first real warmth of spring. She drove herself, which Nora had not expected, had half anticipated some formal arrival, the suggestion of an occasion, but she pulled up in a normal silver car, got out alone and walked up the path in a coat Nora recognized as the one she'd had for years. The good navy blue one from before the company expanded, and Diane's wardrobe had expanded with it. She looked older. Not aged exactly. Diane was not a woman who aged in obvious ways, but less certain of her own architecture, the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight has begun to show in how they hold themselves. Nora opened the door before Julian could. Diane stopped on the porch. They looked at each other. "You don't have to invite me in," Diane said. "I know." Nora stepped back from the door. Diane came in. They sat in the living room, the 3 of them. Chloe asleep upstairs, the spring afternoon coming through the tall windows, the lake visible beyond the trees beginning to green. Julian made tea the way he always did when he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. Diane sat in the chair across from Nora. "I'm not here to re-argue," she said. It was directed at both of them, but she was looking at Nora. "I know what I did. I know what it cost." She paused. "I think I understood it intellectually before when Julian came to Seattle. But then the baby, when I found out she'd been born and was healthy and was—" She stopped. Her composure, which had always been exceptional, showed a fine crack along its edge. "I've been sitting with it since January, what I was willing to do. What I decided was acceptable." "Was it worth it?" Nora asked. Not unkindly. Just a real question. "No." Diane looked at her hands. "No. I had the controlling stake and the title, and none of it is worth sitting here across from a person I caused real harm to and having no adequate explanation." She looked up. "I can give you accurate reasons. I can tell you exactly how I arrived at each decision point, but I can't give you a justification. I'm aware of the difference." Julian from the kitchen doorway said, That's honest. It's the minimum I could offer. He came and sat beside Nora. He did not say anything else. He waited in the way that Julian waited, completely, with the patience of someone who understood that silence was not emptiness, but the space in which other people could arrive at their own truths. Diane looked at him. I've transferred the board seat. It's done. The paperwork cleared last week. I'm leaving the company entirely. I've accepted a position with a nonprofit foundation in Boston health policy work. I leave in June. Julian nodded. Okay. I'm not telling you for approval. I'm telling you so you know it's done. She paused. And I wanted to ask the baby. Chloe. She said the name carefully, like someone handling something that wasn't hers. I don't expect I'm not asking for access or for I know I've given up any right to that. I just wanted to know if she's well. A silence. Nora looked at Julian. He looked at her. She's well, Nora said. She has a spreadsheet named after her. Diane blinked. It's a long story, Julian said. Something moved across Diane's face. Brief complicated the expression of a person encountering normalcy they have forfeited their right to inhabit. Then she composed herself, set her tea down, and stood. Thank you for seeing me, she said. Both of you. She looked at Nora specifically. I know this wasn't easy. No, Nora said, but it was right. Diane nodded. She went to the door. She let herself out. Through the window, they watched her walk back to her car and drive away down the private road through the gate, and then she was gone. Julian sat beside Nora in the quiet room. How do you feel? He said. She thought about it honestly. Lighter, she said. Is that strange? No. He took her hand. Not at all. In April, when the lake cleared and the bass moved into the shallows, and the dock boards had been replaced correctly on the third attempt, which Julian had announced with the particular satisfaction of a man who has learned to accept his own process. Nora sat on the dock with her feet over the edge and Chloe in the sling against her chest, and watched Julian try to teach himself to fish. He was, as he had predicted, a mediocre fisherman. He was also not in any hurry to be otherwise. You're holding the rod at the wrong angle, she said. He looked at her. How do you know the right angle? My father taught me when I was 7. Your father fished every Sunday morning, religiously. She shifted Chloe slightly. He was very bad at it, too. He said the point wasn't the fish. What was the point? Sundays, she said. Julian considered this. He looked at the rod. He adjusted the angle not toward her suggested correction, but toward something he'd worked out independently, and cast again. The line arced out over the lake and landed in the approximate vicinity of where he'd been aiming. Better, she said. Don't patronize me. I'm genuinely saying it's better. He looked at her for a moment and the corner of his mouth moved. Chloe in the sling made a sound. She agrees, Nora said. She's 12 weeks old. She has opinions. Julian agreed, always had opinions. The afternoon moved around them in the way that good spring afternoons do, slowly, generously, without any particular insistence on arriving at the evening. The lake surface shifted in small, easy movements. The trees along the far bank were properly green now, the kind of green that came after the long gray winter and made you understand why people had for centuries associated spring with resurrection. Nora looked at the water and thought about Portland in December, about a woman named Elena Park who had worked at a bookshop and carried groceries home in the rain and had a very good life that was not in the end her life. She thought about the bus rides and the false name and the prenatal appointments and the specific quality of a December night in a hotel room on the edge of a bathtub shaking. She thought about stepping out of a bookshop and looking across a wet street and seeing a man standing beside a black SUV. She thought about the cost of things, the strange arithmetic of fear and love and the choices you made in the dark that you could not take back, but that sometimes led you to exactly where you were supposed to be. Julian, she said. He was studying the rod with the focused attention of someone who has decided that mediocrity is temporary. I want to get married again. He went still. Not a big ceremony, she said. Not the hotel and the 400 guests and the floral arrangements that took 6 months to plan. Something small. Here, maybe. Just us and Thomas and Dr. Sullivan and whoever Chloe has become by the time we do it. He turned around. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on that rainy Portland sidewalk, like a man receiving information he had already on some level accounted for, except that this time there was no suppression, no controlled surface, just the full, undefended face of him lit by the April afternoon. Yes, he said. That's all. Just yes. I've been waiting for you to ask me since January. He set the rod down. He walked down the dock toward her unhurried and crouched beside her to be at her level. Chloe and the sling regarded him with serious attention. I had a whole speech prepared. What was in it? Everything that should have been in the first one. He took her hand. That I know what I'm choosing and why. That I understand what I'm asking and what it requires. That I'm not choosing you because you're the mother of my daughter, or because you came back, or because everything is easier when you're here, though all of those things are true. He paused. I'm choosing you because you are the most honest person I know and the most inconveniently stubborn, and the best thing that ever came into my life, and I intend to keep choosing you for as long as you'll permit it. She looked at him. That's a good speech, she said. I had time. You should have led with it. I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it. She pressed her free hand against the side of his face, the specific gesture of recognition, of here you are, of I know this face, and he turned his head slightly into it, and Chloe between them made a sound of general satisfaction. Yes, Nora said. Of course, yes. They were married in June on a Thursday afternoon on the dock. The sky was the particular pale blue of early summer, the kind that arrived in the Pacific Northwest for exactly 6 weeks a year, and that everyone who lived there spent the other 46 weeks quietly missing. The lake was still. The dock boards recently replaced held solid underfoot. Nora wore a dress she had chosen herself. Soft blue, not white, not the first wedding's color. She had explained to Julian that this was deliberate, that she wanted to be wearing something that had not existed before this version of them, and he had looked at her with the expression she had catalogued under the heading of understands completely and will not require further elaboration. Julian wore a suit but without the tie. It was the first time she had seen him at a formal occasion without a tie in the entire course of their acquaintance. She had thought about saying something. She did not say something. She let it be exactly what it was, a man who had decided that this occasion did not require armor. Thomas cried during the vows. He did not acknowledge this. It simply happened quietly and then stopped, and he stood up straight again and looked at the lake with professional composure, and no one mentioned it. Dr. Sullivan did not cry, but she did say during the brief reception on the porch afterward that in 30 years of obstetric practice, she had attended approximately 12 weddings of patients, and this was the first one that had made her feel she was witnessing something actually true. Chloe, 4 months old and strapped to Thomas's chest in the carrier Thomas had researched and purchased, and was wearing with the grave dedication of someone performing an important function, slept through the ceremony and woke during the cake, and ate a quantity of buttercream frosting that Dr. Sullivan observed with professional concern, and that Julian logged in the spreadsheet under a new column labeled Special Events. In the evening, when the guests had gone and Chloe was asleep upstairs and the porch was quiet, and the lake was doing its June thing of reflecting the long northern dusk in colors that had no adequate names, they sat together in the chairs they had sat in since December, and held their drinks and looked at the water. Married again, Nora said. Married again. He turned his glass in his hands. Better the second time. Much better. She looked at him. Do you know what's different? We are. That's it. That's the whole answer. That's always the whole answer. He reached across the space between the chairs and found her hand. The house is the same. The dock, the water, the people around us. The only thing that changed is what we were willing to be honest about. She held his hand and looked at the lake and listened to the evening settle around them. The birds in the trees across the water, the small sounds of the house behind them, the particular quiet of a place that had been waiting for this and was now simply at rest. 7 months she had run. 7 months of being Elena Park in a secondhand coat, carrying a secret the size of a life building, a careful structure of half-truths that had kept her safe and kept her lonely and had ultimately, on a December evening in the rain, come apart in the best possible way. She did not regret the 7 months. She had made the best decision she could with the information she had and the fear she had for the person who needed protecting above everything else. She would make it again if she had to. But she was very glad she did not have to. She was very glad to be here in this chair on this dock as exactly who she was. Julian, she said. Thank you for waiting 3 hours in the rain. A pause. You're welcome, he said with the absolute seriousness of a man who means it completely. She closed her eyes and let the evening be what it was. Inside the house upstairs, in the east-facing room in the crib that had been waiting 2 years, Chloe Ashworth slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a person who has arrived exactly where she was supposed to be and knows it the way only the very young and the very lucky know such things completely without question, without needing it to be otherwise.
Ama
Sarleterles. Epilogue. 8 months later.
mos
On an October afternoon, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside it, working on the third draft of the article that had been accepted provisionally, pending revisions by a magazine she had been reading since law school. Chloe, 8 months old and in possession of a view of her own locomotion that significantly exceeded her current capacities, was engaged in a sustained attempt to pull herself to standing using the leg of the kitchen table. Julian was in his study on a call with Marcus. The door was open. This was the new architecture Julian still consulted, still received the quarterly reports, still occasionally said things on calls with Marcus that were technically advisory and practically unavoidable for a man with his investment stake and his temperament. He did this from the study with the door open, and the calls did not extend into dinner, and if Chloe wanted his attention between calls, she got it without negotiation. He had described this arrangement when asked by Marcus how it was working as adequate. He had described it to Nora when she asked the same question as better than I expected, which was itself better than I deserved. Chloe's fingers found the table leg. She pulled. She got approximately 2 inches off the ground, made a sound of triumph, and sat back down with the expression of someone who has logged a successful test run. You're going to be walking by Christmas, Nora told her. Chloe looked at the table leg, then at Nora, then back at the table leg. From the study, Nora heard Julian's call wind down, the specific cadence of a conversation being concluded efficiently, the brief final exchange, the silence that followed. Then footsteps. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Chloe mid-attempt at her second pull to stand. He looked at Nora. How's the article, he said. Third draft. Better. Better how? I cut the opening paragraph and started with the second one. He crossed to look at the screen over her shoulder the way he did, not invasively. Just the natural movement of a person who was interested in what the person he loved was doing. He read the opening. Yes, he said. That's better. I know. You knew before I read it. I wanted a second opinion. You wanted confirmation. That's what a second opinion is. Chloe made a sound of effort. They both looked. She had achieved for approximately 1 full second a genuine standing position, both hands on the table leg, knees, locked, the specific face of someone who has done something they weren't certain was possible. Then she sat down. Then she looked at both of them with an expression that very clearly meant, you saw that. We saw that, Julian said. He crouched down, picked her up, held her the way he had learned to hold her over 8 months of practice, securely, naturally, the particular confidence of a person for whom a skill has stopped requiring conscious attention. She grabbed his collar immediately. She has opinions about your collar, Nora said. She has opinions about everything. He looked at Chloe with the expression that Nora had come to think of as his most honest face, the one that appeared only here in this house, in these rooms, when the professional surface was not required and the person underneath it was simply present. She gets that from her mother. Chloe made a sound of general agreement. Nora went back to her article. Outside, the October lake was the color of slate, and the trees were going gold at the edges in the particular unhurried way of Pacific Northwest autumns, and the dockboards held solid, and the house settled around them in the way of houses that know what they're for. It was not a perfect life. It had not been a clean path. It had required the specific kind of courage that looks from the outside like chaos. The courage to run when running was the only option, and to return when returning was, and to say the true thing when the true thing was ready to be said. But it was theirs, completely, entirely, honestly theirs, and that it turned out was everything.